This is the final video presentation for Team FPGA on the Leduc Poker Challenge. Since Chris and I will not be at the same place, we will be filming our presentation separately and then combining together, where I will go over the first half of the project and Chris will go over the second half of the project progress. So we'll quickly go over the problem setting. It's the four-player Leduc Poker Challenge. It's composed of two teams, where we have Team 1 free composed of the player that goes first and the player that goes third, and Team 2 4 defined analogously. We have a six-card deck, where we have Jack, Queen, and King, two of each, and we have two betting rounds with fixed raise amount. The twist of our game is that we allow for some cheating, so teammates can actually jointly sample from a shared global signal before the game starts, and they can use that global signal's result to decide on a correlated strategy that is predetermined. So the teammates can kind of collude with each other and then talk about like if the global signal is this, then they will play this linked strategy between the two of them. However, no communication is allowed during the game. So once they have that correlated strategy based on the global signal, they cannot change it. They cannot communicate during the game based on what cards they have. And this is crucial because if they were allowed to communicate during the game, we can kind of just model them as the whole team as a single player. And we know that games with single player and perfect information is actually like solved rather well in the field of game theory. So our initial approach is heuristic signaling. So initially when we looked at this game, there were only six cards and two rounds and four players. So we thought that like we can actually like come up with some hard-coded strategies since there are only so many cases. And one of our first ideas was to use the signaling. So where the first player on each team, like who goes first, will use round one to signal private card to teammate, where the signaling scheme is like roughly based on card stream. So if player one on team one free has a jack, they will fold. And if they have a queen, they will check or call. And if they have a king, they will raise. The idea was that the pl the second teammate can use that signal from the first player and use that information to make like an optimal decision. So for example, if the first player signals Jack by folding, and then the second player on the team looks at their card and they also see a Jack, the intuitive best option would just to be folding. Because if you know that if you're on the team and your teammate has a Jack and you also have a Jack, you know that the other team will have queens and kings because there are only two jacks in the deck. So the only way for you to actually win in terms of card strength is to match that jack with a community card that's also a jack, but that's impossible since your team has all the jacks. So we kind of like performed a similar analysis on all the other cases for the second player, and we decide how cautious and aggressive one can play based on analyzing the expected value, and we kind of just hard-coded our strategies as an initial attempt. So there were a lot of limitations, and this approach actually didn't work out that well. Actually, they had a pretty high exploitable score, where the exploitability was around 5, which is not that far off from the exploitability of the uniform strategy, which is around 6. So we deduced that signaling conventions are really exploitable. Like other teams with better strategies, they can clearly just kind of exploit our intuition that we fold when we have a jack. And signaling can also like carry inherent costs. So for example, in our signaling scheme, the first player essentially has no choice. Whatever their card is will dictate how they will act on the first round. When they have a jack, then they must fold to ensure that the right signal is passed to the second teammate. But folding a jack may not always be the best choice. Like for example, like if we have a jack and then the community card ends up being a jack, then we would have tossed away a win by using this strategy. Although the strategy based on heuristic didn't turn out to be like what we wanted, it did build intuition about the game dynamics and the information structure and made us pivot towards like more algorithmic approaches. So one of the approaches that we tried was team belief tag. Although I said that it was the second approach, in reality, this was one of the last approaches we did. We mainly spent our time on Team Cyril, but we wanted to explore this towards the end of the project to see if we can get lower exploitability scores. So the intuition for this approach is to convert the team game to perfect information by representing the team game as a TB DAG. Then this TB DAG structure, we can run CFR on it, and we can pick our regret minimization algorithm to do so. And to explain what a TB DAG is, I borrowed a figure from the original paper from Zhang that explained and kind of came up with this concept. Um, the figure in A is basically the game tree for the team game, and in part C, it's this TB-DAG form. It looks complicated, but intuitively, the nodes kind of just represent the joint state that each team is allowed to be in. So the black nodes are like um, the black team, and like the black node BC would correspond to like one team member in B and other team member in C. And then all the actions at these joint states or these nodes are kind of just representing all the legal combination of actions the team members can take. So the intuition is that the TB-DAG actually encodes all the information of the tree from the team game. And the TB-DAG is strategically equivalent to original team game tree. And since the TB-DAG is a lot nicer to like kind of apply CFR on it, we can just use CFR on the TB-DAG and self-play the optimal strategies against each other to yield adversarially robust strategies. And in that case, we would have solved the original team game, and that was the idea. So we implemented TB-DAG and then ran it through iterations of self-play. And we have two variants where one TB-DAG just outputs one strategy, and in the other case, we train five like CFRs on a TB-DAG independently with five overall strategies. In both of these cases, we did see exploitability scores go down from 6 all the way to 3.2 or 3.3 after 1,000 iterations. So it is like performing better than a heuristic approach, but we also noticed like a couple of concerning things. In this case, it's plateauing at 1,000, but according to the original paper, it actually does much better at 1,000 iterations in terms of um, reducing exploitability and actually continues to go down close to the actual equilibrium, which would have an exploitability score of 0. Part of the reason is that we kind of started Team Belief DAG very last minute, and that kind of caused us to not be able to debug it properly. But in order to deliver some results, we continue and went ahead with this one. Our team's most successful approach was actually Team Saro, which Chris will take over and explain.
Hi, I'm Chris, and I'll be walking us through Team Syro, which is our main training group for learning strong team strategies in large zero-sum games. At each iteration T, we maintain two populations of joint team policies, which are denoted by the big pies. Each policy here is a full coordinated strategy for the entire team and not an individual agent policy. This is where our algorithm differs from the original Syro. The first step is metagame construction. We evaluate every pair of population strategies and build a payoff matrix AIJ, where each entry in the matrix corresponds to the combined expected utility of players 1 and 3, under the assumption that Team 1-3 plays strategy I and Team 2-4 plays strategy J. This gives us a finite normal form game over the current populations. We then compute meta strategies over these populations using fictitious play, as shown on the right here. Fictitious play iteratively computes best responses to the opponent's empirical mix strategy and updates frequency counts. After T iterations, we obtain mixed strategies little sigma of each team, which is just a normalization over the frequency counts of the best responses. Next comes population expansion, which is the core driver of Syro. Using the meta strategies, we form opponent mixture policies little pi bar, which is given by a weighted sum of the meta strategy weights multiplied by the individual strategy weights for each action. We then use a CFR-based oracle to compute a best response against the opponent's mixture policy. We then append this new best response to our current population of strategies, and then we do the same for both teams. This expands their strategy space in directions that directly exploit their opponent's current mixture. So, overall, Team Syro alternates between solving a restricted metagame over known strategies and discovering new strategies that are maximally exploitative against the current meta solution. Now I'll move on to our Team Syro results. We trained 4 different Team Syro configurations, varying both the number of fictitious play iterations used to solve the metagame and the number of Team Syro population expansion iterations. Specifically, we tested 100 rounds of fictitious play with 10 Syro iterations, 200 rounds of fictitious play with 30 Syro iterations, 100 rounds of fictitious play with 30 Syro iterations, and 500 rounds of fictitious play with 50 Syro iterations. Because each Syro iteration required evaluating new strategies and computing approximate best responses, training was extremely expensive. These configurations range from about 4 hours for the smallest run to nearly 60 hours for the largest, which limited the number of configurations we could realistically explore. In terms of exploitability, configurations 2 to 4 achieve exploitabilities of approximately 3.8, 3.3, 3.6, 3.0, and 3.2 and 2.7 for Team 1.3 and 2.4 respectively. As expected, increasing the number of Cyro iterations generally reduced exploitability, since more iterations expanded the population and increased strategic diversity. However, one interesting observation is that Configuration 3, using fewer fictitious player iterations than Configuration 2, actually achieved lower exploitability. We believe this is due to overfitting in the metagame solver early in training. In early Cyro iterations, the population is still very incomplete, so fictitious play may converge to a meta strategy that is optimal for a poorly approximated game. Running fictitious play for too long in a setting can overweight weak strategies, leading to a meta strategy becomes highly exploitable once new best responses are introduced. On the other hand, increasing the number of Cyro iterations consistently helped. As the population grows, the meta strategy is supported by a richer and more diverse set of strategies, making the resulting playstyle less predictable and harder to exploit. Despite this, our measured exploitability remained relatively high compared to some other teams. Even so, our agent outperformed more than half of the competitors in the final evaluation. We believe this apparent discrepancy arises because Team Cyro explicitly computes approximate best responses at every iteration, rather than committing to a single fixed equilibrium strategy. In practice, the growing population of strong counter strategies allows the agent to adapt effectively to a wide range of opponents, even if the final meta strategy remains theoretically exploitable. Here, we plot metagame values over training iterations for Configuration 4. Initially, we heavily favored Team 2-4, but we eventually stabilized in favor of Team 1-3 at the end. The bottom plot shows the best response gap values for both teams. These measure how much each team can improve by computing a new best response against the opponent's current meta strategy. Throughout training, both gaps remained strictly positive and oscillatory rather than converging to zero. In terms of limitations, our implementation of Team Cyro was extremely slow and didn't perform as well as other agents. To improve performance, we could replace CFR with multi-agent reinforcement learning approaches like MAPO, as discussed in Gabriella's Team Cyro paper. We just use CFR because we are already familiar with it from the P-sets. Other than that, we can probably improve training time by reusing previous results across configurations, meaning that we don't start from a uniform strategy each time and just reuse our previous configurations to train the next one. Finally, we could employ CFR Plus or Monte Carlo CFR, which employs sampling-based methods that could substantially improve our training times. That concludes our presentation. Thank you for a great semester and listening to our project.